Hello, class. I'm back here for, lecture number 9 for History 102. We basically talked about Theodore Roosevelt becoming president, lecture number 8. So we're going to wrap up a couple of things in chapter 27 now that we have Roosevelt president. The rest of that chapter sort of focuses on foreign policy. So we want to talk about a couple of foreign policy accomplishments of Roosevelt while he was president of the United States. So we're going to kind of just cover Roosevelt's presidency from different perspectives. And you'll have to remember that Roosevelt assumed office in September 1901 after President McKinley's untimely death. He'll be reelected, or elected for the first time, I should say, in 1904. We'll talk about that later on. And he'll serve as president until March of 1909, when he'll retire. So, after he takes over, a couple of accomplishments covered in chapter 27. One thing that he makes a priority right off the bat when he becomes president is that he knows we need a shortcut between the Caribbean and the Pacific for the Great White Fleet, because we're at a turning point. We are a Pacific power, we're an Atlantic power, we're an emerging power, as we've discovered. And either they're going to have to spend the money to build a gigantic Atlantic steel navy and a Pacific steel navy, or they're going to have to make it so the two smaller fleets could go and reinforce each other easier. So at this point, for the Pacific Fleet to sail to reinforce activities in the Atlantic Fleet, it would take 75 days to sail around the tip of South America. So, as we know, Spanish-American War didn't even last 75 days, so the war could be over with before the Navy got there where it needed to be. So what Roosevelt wants is a shortcut. And obviously what we're talking about here is the Panama Canal. Now, the Panama Canal, there was two places in the running. Obviously, Panama, because it's a very narrow isthmus, and that will be selected as the site. The other site that was in the running right up to the end was a canal through Nicaragua. Now, it'd be a much longer canal, but in Nicaragua, they could utilize natural rivers, a lake, and essentially have to dig about the same amount of canal. The one thing Nicaragua had going for it was the climate was much better. I realize it's in Central America, but Panama is almost right at the equator at sea level. And it's extremely hot, humid all year long there. A lot of the area where the canal was dug was in swampy areas filled with malaria and other diseases. So environmentally speaking, it was less than an optimal site. The Nicaraguan site had one thing working against it. That was volcanoes. And volcanoes become a world event in 1903 when a horrible volcano erupts on the island country of Martinique and kills thousands and thousands of people. And it just, erupts. Nobody really knew it was a volcanic mountain. Cities were built right at its base on this island in the Caribbean, and it was a horrible disaster and really brought volcanoes into the national spotlight. Right at the time when they're trying to figure out where to build this shortcut. So, to make a long story short, Panama will be selected. Panama, in this process, will end up declaring its independence from Colombia. It had been part of the nation of Colombia, northern province. An independence movement there declared independence. The United States supported that action and will sign the Panama Canal Treaty in 19 1903 with the brand new Panamanian government. And construction on the Panama Canal will begin in 1904. Now, that Panama Canal Treaty was a 99-year lease that the United States received from Panama for the price of $10 million and with payments of $250,000 a year annually. Gave us a 6-mile wide zone. Now, that Panama Canal Treaty was signed in 1903, but as many of you know, we'll end that treaty in the 1970s during the Carter administration and hand back the Panama Canal to Panama early because by that point in the 1970s, it no longer served our purposes because our giant aircraft carriers wouldn't fit in the canal, and neither would gigantic oil tankers. So we gave it back to the Panamanians in the 1970s. Now, if you look in your textbook on page 640-41, there's this panoramic view that covers both pages of the most difficult part of constructing canal when they had to go through the Continental Divide at a place called the Culebra Cut. Now, the Panama Canal is going to be the biggest project of its kind ever taken on in the world in 1904. And it'll end up costing about $400 million, which for that time period is unprecedented. Take 10 years to construct. It'll finally be completed in 1914. And it was quite a project. They had to go through several different project leaders till they finally found competent engineers and so forth to pull off this amazing stunt. Unfortunately, hundreds of construction workers died constructing this canal from accidents or the diseases that were prevalent in Panama. But it's something that kind of shows Roosevelt's foresight. It opened just in time because in 1914, as we'll find out, World War I begins. And it becomes a very vital connection for the Allies during World War I. Now, another item that they talk about in this chapter on foreign policy, right on the bottom of page 641, you see a famous cartoon of Theodore Roosevelt marching around in the Caribbean with his big stick over his shoulder because he was known for his quote-unquote big stick foreign policy because he's the one who said, speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far. Roosevelt gained some criticism from his critics for his foreign policy in the Caribbean, but he referred to it as preventative intervention, and he attempted to make sure that Latin American countries remained free when nations like Germany and others were attempting to take over places like Venezuela, and the United States would intervene and solve these problems for these countries so they could remain independent. Sometimes this is also known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but others call it the big stick policy. Now, finally, the last foreign policy accomplishment that we want to talk about with Theodore Roosevelt is something that happened in 1904, 1905. In 1904, a horrible war broke out between Russia and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War. And Japan was a rising power at the time, and were on their way, if they wanted to conquer Russia. But they really didn't want to. Russia invaded parts of Japanese holdings, and they repelled them from there. And this had the potential of turning into our First World War. So what happened was The Japanese, who Roosevelt had forged very good relationships with, because at Harvard, his minor was Japanese culture, and he greatly admired Japan and was trying to make better relations with them, came to Theodore Roosevelt in 1904, telling him about their worries of how this could escalate into a world war, and asked him if he would please sponsor a peace conference. Roosevelt agrees, and in 1905, a peace conference was held in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where Roosevelt himself attending many of these negotiation sessions, as well as his Secretary of State, John Hay, hammered out an agreement, and this ended this horrible war before it escalated into potentially a world war. Roosevelt was very proud of this accomplishment, and in fact, in 1906, the very next year, Theodore Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this activity, and in Roosevelt's memoirs, winning that Nobel Peace Prize was the thing that he was most proud of that he accomplished during his great career of public service. Now, one other thing that we want to mention at the very end of this chapter that's also sort of related to the Japanese is in 1906, there was a horrible earthquake in San Francisco. And this great quake, as it's known, basically destroyed the city. Now, I believe there might be a picture of the quake in your textbook here. I might be wrong. Bear with me. Yeah, they took that picture out. This is all covered on 645 in your book, though. The quake's horrible. The city has to be rebuilt. What wasn't knocked down by the quake was burned by the fires that followed, because the city was all hooked up to natural gas. And so the city's going to have to be rebuilt, and the federal government's going to assist them in this. Now, unfortunately, the state of California, as we're going to find out, has a long legacy of racism towards people from Asia, Chinese and Japanese people. And racism is going to rear its ugly head when the San Francisco Board of Education decides to completely reorganize the school district there in the city that they have to completely rebuild because it's been destroyed. They unveil their plan for this reorganization, and within the plan are these schools that are labeled special schools. And when people look into what the purpose of these quote-unquote special schools are, they are strictly going to be attended by Japanese and Chinese students. And there are large populations of both of those ethnic groups. San Francisco has one of the largest Chinatowns in America still today. And they're all going to be segregated, basically what this means, away from the white students. Now, Japanese parents especially have a fit when they find out what's going on with this new reorganization of the San Francisco school district. Part of Japanese culture, if you don't know it, there's a great deal of emphasis placed on the education of their children. Their kids go to school 12 months a year. There's no summer break for K through 12. And most parents hire tutors to tutor their kids in the evening every night because there's such an emphasis on education. I know this because in graduate school, I served as a graduate assistant for a very bright Japanese professor, Suneo Akaha, and he told me about his experiences in his life and the experiences of his parents. He's now a professor out at the Monterey Institute for International Relations in California. Now, so the Japanese embassy visits the White House to express their displeasure over this brand new segregated school district. Theodore Roosevelt is furious. He spent all this time trying to forge a brand new relationship with Japan, And now these screwballs in San Francisco on the Board of Education are throwing it all to the wind. So what he does is he immediately summons the San Francisco School Board to hop on the next train and come to the White House, which they do. I mean, if the president summons you to the White House, you typically drop everything and go to the White House. When they arrive, he basically tells them, schools are controlled by local entities, like the San Francisco Board of Education. But I do have some input into what's going to happen here. Even though I don't really have input, I can't tell you how you can draw up your new school district. But what he tells them is, if you insist on having the segregated school for Asian children, I will not allow a federal cent to be spent in San Francisco to rebuild your city. I do have the power over those purse strings, and I won't release any money. So you better rethink your new district or be prepared to go back and explain to your citizens and taxpayers in San Francisco and California why they're going to have to foot the bill because of your prejudice. The San Francisco Board of Education reconsiders their plan. They come out of the White House, announce a gentleman's agreement, and they do away with this segregated school district. Theodore Roosevelt prevails on the side of equality. Now, what I want to shift to and introduce here in the last part of this lecture is we're moving on to chapter 28, and you'll notice the title of that chapter is Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt. Now, we're going to enter a brand new era. We have exited the Gilded Age, and now we're in the Progressive era, which basically lasts from about 1900 until approximately 1920. Now, the Progressive era is a very unique era in American history. And when we think about it from one standpoint, it only makes sense that it happened. It's a direct response to the Gilded Age, that concentration of wealth that took place, the mistreatment of workers having to work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day for peanuts, the mistreatment of people, the corruption, everything else that we talked about associated with the Gilded Age. When you have a horrible period like that, typically you're going to be followed by a period of great reform to fix the ills of the previous age. Now, this sort of started in the late 1890s with the Populist Party. But unfortunately, the Populist Party, who had offered up many of the reforms that the progressives will successfully accomplish, kind of got lost in the shuffle because of the Panic of 1893. You typically don't have periods of reform during a depression because the funds aren't there for it. But soon as President McKinley pulls us out of that horrible depression, and then Theodore Roosevelt takes over as president in 1901, it's time for reform because the economy's booming once again. And now we have a president in the White House who is definitely willing to clean this mess up, which Roosevelt and other leading progressives will certainly do. Now, I want to tell you a little bit more basically about what progressives stood for. Progressives were a movement that touched all aspects of life in America. It wasn't just simply a political movement, but obviously a lot of its grounding was in politics and political reform. It was an intellectual movement, and it was fueled by the brand new set of what we call today social sciences that came into being and were prominent at colleges and universities across this country, like sociology and the great W.E.B. Du Bois, psychology, Freud and Jung, Political science became a discipline instead of just calling it government. History really came forward and took its rightful place in colleges and universities. So all these brand new social sciences start to offer up suggestions and solutions to the problems that plagued us during the Gilded Age. And one thing that they all agreed upon was that human beings were basically good in nature. That human nature was something that was good. Humans didn't really want to do the wrong thing, and they needed to be guided to do the correct thing. Now, also the Progressive Era was a cultural era. There were films and literature that can be directly associated with the Progressive Era. There were journalists who were progressives, known as muckrakers. And by the way, Theodore Roosevelt coined that term also. There was even progressive architecture and furniture styles. Frank Lloyd Wright was a great progressive architect. Adolf Stickley was a great manufacturer of progressive, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as mission style or arts and crafts furniture. He operated out of Syracuse, New York, and it was a real simplistic, natural style that dominated this era. So it touched every aspect of society. Now, one of their characteristics was they wanted to humanize the effects of industrialization that had taken place in America. Now, to give you an idea of what they were talking about, human beings were being treated more or less like parts in a machine. They're all working in these factories. There's no care whatsoever taken for factory safety like today. And people were constantly being hurt, sometimes severely, on the job. Part of it was because there was no care for safety. The other part was people get tired working 12 hours a day doing the same damn thing on a machine. And unfortunately, people were treated like a part in a machine. If a part breaks in a machine, you go get a new part and fix the machine and get it running again. That's how industrialists treated their employees. Somebody got hurt on the job, oh well, there's another immigrant coming off a boat on Ellis Island willing to be the brand new part on the machine. And people got hurt on the job. There was no such thing as workman's compensation. You had to pay your own medical bills, and there was no guarantee your job would be there waiting for you if you did become well enough to work again. All of that had to change. Now, progressives were willing to come up with solutions to the problems that plagued all aspects of society in the Gilded Age. And they had a slogan that they used. They used to say that progressives would, quote, investigate, educate, and legislate. Now, once again, it's investigate, educate, legislate. That was their mission. So, when we come back next for the next lecture here in a few minutes, I'm going to give you a prime example of progressives investigating, educating, and legislating. Then we're going to talk about some other things related to the progressive movement in general. Then we'll talk about Theodore Roosevelt's overall package of progressive reforms, which he called his Square Deal. So, I'll be back shortly to tell you all about those things. Thanks a lot for listening to me. Take care of yourselves.